introduce Shane White, who is the Cheadle Professor of History in the Department of History at the University of Sydney in Australia. From 2011 to 2015, he was an Australian Research Council Professorial Fellow. Shane's research and area of expertise includes United States history, African American history, and the history of New York City. He is a co-author of Playing the Numbers, Gambling in Harlem Between the Wars, The Sounds of Slavery, Discovering African American History Through Songs, Sermons, and Speech, and a collaborative project, The Year of the Riot, about Harlem in 1935. So as I said, for the next 75 minutes, which is going to include your questions, we're going to learn the story from his well-researched bestseller, The Prince of Darkness, the untold story of Jeremiah G. Hamilton, America's first Black millionaire. Good day, mate. Hello and welcome, Professor Shane.
Good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for getting up so early in Australia. We really appreciate you being here.
No worries at all.
So we're going to take a journey, everyone, from the Caribbean to New York, to upstate New York, to New Jersey, back to New York, to Brooklyn. Tell us, Shane, who was Jeremiah G. Hamilton when he boarded that ship from St. Croix to New York City?
We know very little about him, about his origins. There are different stories he told about where he came from and what he was. So possibly he was born in Virginia and came up to New York probably in around about 1828. I think he probably came from the Caribbean, probably from, my guess is that he probably came from somewhere near Port-au-Prince in Haiti. What was born in the first Black Republic would be my guess. Because of the revolution in Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, there is a large number of people shifting around in the Caribbean, and I think he was part of the flotsam and jetsam that came out of that. And he comes up to, somehow he gets in with a consortium of New York merchants in 1828, and they fund him and send him back down to Port-au-Prince with a whole bunch of counterfeit coin for him to shove, is the term, to get rid of counterfeit coin. And he goes down to Haiti with several $1,000s worth of counterfeit coin, and he gets caught. They get found out down there. The counterfeit coin. New York was the thing America was probably, one of the things America was famous for, which it doesn't acknowledge, is that it was the world center of counterfeiting. There's more counterfeit, something like between 30 and 40% of the currency in America was counterfeit. It's a very weird financial system that America has. It's mostly counterfeit notes rather than coin, but this was counterfeit coin that was coined probably in New Jersey or possibly up in Canada and then sent down to Haiti. They get caught because the counterfeit coin had too much silver content. It was too good in a way, and someone in the bank tests the coin and finds out that it's way above what the Haitian silver content of the Haitian coin is. And so he knows he's caught. They know the game's up, and he sort of runs away and hides and is sort of sheltered by Haitian fishermen for a couple of days before he can hop on a boat and go back to New York City. And there's a big fuss about it up in New York because the South in America is terrified of Haiti, doesn't want anything to do with Haiti because they're feared of slave rebellions and the rebellious ideas coming out of Haiti. But the North is trading with Haiti and selling a lot of stuff down there. And so the big fuss in the New York newspapers is about how the reputation of America as a trading partner is being ruined by this guy selling a counterfeit coin. And the first ever black newspaper has started up in 1827, Freedom's Journal, and they're horrified by what Hamilton has done, because to them, Haiti is a beacon of the possibility of what the future can be, and this guy is undermining it and trying to ruin it. So this is his first. This is where he suddenly appears on the historical record. Before 1828, we know nothing.
And he was about in his 20s. He left Haiti not because he wanted to go and tour New York, but he was sentenced to death, correct? He was under that kind of duress. And John Russwurm, who he created with his business partner, Freedom Journal, the first African-American newspaper in America, were your early research, his coverage of Jeremiah Hamilton and his friends in terms of what they were doing in Haiti? Was that the first documented in terms of a newspaper, John Russwurm's coverage of Jeremiah?
Well, the coverage in the Freedom's Journal is mostly reprinted articles from other newspapers with Russwurm's editorial comment on the top saying, "Isn't this horrible?" and then prints from the commercial advertiser or various other things. This is the first, the white newspapers or that print stories about this in early 1828. That's the first mention. Freedom's Journal jumps on the bandwagon and condemns even more strongly than the other newspapers do what Hamilton has been doing down in Haiti.
And I think it's worth just taking a pause for a second to outline what the backdrop was of New York at that time. When he arrived here in New York, the government had just abolished slavery, which doesn't mean, everything goes back to normal or we're treating African Americans or anyone in a humanistic way. But could you just lay out what the backdrop was when he arrived here, and what did he look like?
Well, this slavery ends gradually in New York State, and for the moment, what you've got to remember is that New York is probably the first city or place of any size that has to deal with what happens after slavery. So it's one of the pioneers in working out, what do you do with free blacks, as they are now often called, free coloreds? What's going to be the relationship? And it's being negotiated. As far as many whites are concerned, African Americans are going to be pretty much in the same position. I mean, you don't call them slaves anymore. As far as African Americans are concerned, freedom has got to mean something that's a whole lot better than slavery. And so there's this pushing and shoving, trying to work out what the situation actually is. New York in the late 1820s, 1830s, and into the first half of the 1840s, the result of freedom actually is there's a cultural convulsion. Things are going backwards and forwards between black and white in ways that's not going to happen again until the 1920s and the 1930s with the Harlem Renaissance. So this can range from tap dancing, for example, is invented in New York City in the dancing cellars that are part of the response to the end of slavery. So it's black and white are dealing with one another in completely new ways, and that includes violence, so that there's a lot of pushing and shoving around the edges. And every now and again, things will just erupt into violence. 1834 is one of the worst race riots in New York City's history. And then in 1863, the draft riots is undoubtedly the worst point of race relations in New York City's history. And in between, there's sporadic violence. So a black man walking or woman walking down the street, for the most part, nothing's going to happen. But there's the potential for pushing and shoving and using the M word and sort of disrespecting them. On the other hand, blacks are now free, and there's this ebullience of African American culture expressed in dance, in clothing, so you get long accounts of blacks walking down up Broadway wearing what seems to whites outrageous clothes and top hats and twirling their sticks and not giving the wall, as in not moving into the street and allowing whites to walk closer to the wall, because the streets are full of water and crap, basically. And so the further you can get from the street when you're walking down the sidewalk, the more likely you are not to get covered in the stuff being put up. So blacks are not giving the wall to the whites anymore. So there's literally, freedom is literally being negotiated on the street as to who can walk where. And so blacks are no longer deferential. And whites notice this. And so the newspapers, there's a constant litany of complaint about the way blacks just aren't behaving the way they used to, is the sort of tone of this lament.
So Jeremiah,
and as to Jeremiah Hamilton, we have very little descriptions of him. There's probably a picture of him somewhere in an archive somewhere or other that is filed under anonymous African American, but this one account calls him a dark mulatto being a reference to a mixed race person. So his skin color was possibly dark. What he's notorious for is that he actually, when he arrives in New York to live in the mid-1830s, he shaves his head and wears a wig. So he's famous for his long flowing, quite spectacular wig. Mm-hmm. He had a sort of a high-pitched voice, which sort of was distinctive and could be heard. Had one of those voices that, at a party, one of those voices that people can hear above the hubbub, which, given his penchant for sort of gossip and what have you, sometimes was unfortunate. He was overheard, which again probably didn't endear him to some people.
Well, just want to make sure we covered this point. He was doing business with New York merchants in this counterfeit ring, and in Haiti he was really designated as a mulatto. Were his colleagues with the counterfeit ring, were they mulattoes? Were they black? Were they white? And when he arrived, and it seems like in your book you stopped short of saying that he was passing. That he was never passing. He was just himself. Is that accurate?
I think he was that dark mulatto. I think he was too dark to pass. Mm-hmm. I don't think he could, and everyone knew him. So he is notorious from the 1830s on. He's called the Prince of Darkness or N-word Hamilton or things like that. So there was no way he was going to pass. The merchants he's dealing with remain anonymous. I have suspicions as to who one of them was, at least one of them was, but they're white. So he is the front person for a bunch of whites going down, which is quite remarkable. You'd love to have been there when he was rounded up for this, because he was 20 years old, which you started work younger than you do nowadays often, but still 20 was very, very young to be put in charge of this. He was very, very talented. He was a talented guy. I would love to have met him. I admire his skill and his ability to do things. He reminds me of one of those very smart young black kids who ends up to either being a drug dealer, a basketball player, or something or other, who goes into something there are constraints on what talented young African Americans can do in American history. The thing I like about him is that he actually jumps into a milieu that's totally white. Wall Street is absolutely white, and normally the pioneer African American in any field has to be quiet, polite, deferential, wear a suit and tie. Like Jackie Robinson had to be restrained when he broke into the major leagues. They constantly trying to throw buckets of water over him to calm him down, and saying Jeremiah Hamilton wasn't like that. You hit him, he hit you back and added 10%. And so he is Malcolm X, not Martin Luther King, if you like.
Let's pause here for a poll. I want for everyone, answer this poll. When did you first hear of Jeremiah G. Hamilton? Could you answer the poll there? When did you first hear of Jeremiah G. Hamilton? And then we have a million questions to ask Professor Shane. Okay. When did you first hear of Jeremiah G. Hamilton? Okay, so he's here. He's in New York City. I always want to know I'm following the flow of money. How did he access capital, and what was to launch his first business, and what was his first business?
Well, he actually struggles when he comes into New York in the 1831, 32. And for a while, he's sort of on the fringes of Wall Street. He actually makes his first money by, again, and it's fraudulent. You got to remember that Wall Street, there are almost no rules or laws on Wall Street. The place was a place of dog eat dog. And he has shipping ventures. He over-insures the shipping ventures and then arranges for the ships to be sunk. So
but where did he get the money? Where did he get the money to do this?
It's again, we don't know. He had money. Way I traced him was through lawsuits in the 1830s, right, when he or insurance companies are suing him or he's suing insurance companies. He puts together stuff. I don't know. He's borrowing money, and so some of those lawsuits, because he hasn't paid money back or he owes money or things like that. So it's actually. So one place where I know he got a lot of money was in 1835. A bunch of white guys go to him and give him $25,000, which is the equivalent of $10 million now, right, an awful lot of money, to invest on Wall Street, in the share market, bond market, whatever. And what actually happens is that the biggest disaster in New York history until 9/11 occurs, and there's a big fire down in the business end of town, and almost 700 houses burned down. And those 4 white merchants, their premises were burnt down, so they got no paperwork left. And those four white guys go and see Jeremiah Hamilton and say, "We're ruined. We've lost everything. But at least we've got the $25,000 we invested with you." And he sort of looked up from the desk and said, "What $25,000? And they had no paper. And he walked away with that $25,000. That's the money he uses to invest in real estate in what is the biggest real estate boom in American history that's occurring in 1837, 36, 37. And he buys a whole bunch of land up in Poughkeepsie.
Astoria, Hollis Crow,
yes,
now Astoria.
Yep. So he buys, Astoria and Poughkeepsie.
And New Jersey. And New Jersey. He bought a mansion in New Jersey, correct?
That's in the 1840s. That's a few years later. But the initial plunge in 1836, 37 is in Astoria, what becomes Astoria, and then up in Poughkeepsie. The whole world in 1836, America from Florida to Maine is just going insane over real estate. There's this incredible boom going on. So you get accounts in the newspapers of saying the share market is just dead, but the real estate market is just ridiculous. Like town lots, as in vacant lots uptown, are sort of doubling in price in 2 months, type of that sort of stuff. And inevitably, as happens with every boom, it busted. And as it happens, Jeremiah Hamilton was very, very shrewd. But he bought about 2 weeks before the crash. So he bought real estate and ends up losing money on the real estate. And that sort of drags him. From 1837 to 42, there's basically a depression in America. And Hamilton gets caught up in that.
And according to your book, let's see, only 60 African Americans own real estate in around that time. So he was, and you had to, in order to vote, you had to own real estate. Did you see any records of him voting at all?
No, none at all. It's very, the real estate, initially back in the turn of the century, African Americans could vote and did vote. And so reputedly, the mayoral election in 1814 was decided by black votes. What happens in the 1820s as part of that reaction to blacks becoming free is that restrictions are put on the vote. So you get the vote extended to all white people, but a property qualification was put on African Americans. I think it was $250 worth of property you had to own. And so this restricts to a handful of voters in the whole of New York State, those who could vote. So there's democracy for all whites, but restricting black votes. The push towards democracy for whites eliminates pretty much the black vote, and it's not going to be returned for some time.
And there are other examples of what he was called ruthless, and then other people will say you had to be ruthless if you wanted to survive. Could you share other examples in terms of him being ruthless in business?
He was. Well, one of the ones I really liked was he got into a dispute with a bunch of whites over money for a venture that was taking longer than it should have. And so at that time, Hamilton lived up at Bloomingdale, which is up near Columbia University, up to the top left-hand corner of Central Park. And his opponents arranged for him to be arrested, but they arranged for him to be arrested at 11 o'clock at night so he couldn't post bail, so that he had to spend the night in prison. It was just a way of sort of humiliating him. And so he's dragged down in there. About 2 weeks later, those whites are woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning and they're arrested, and and bail was set so high they had to stay several days in prison locked up before they could get out. Again, you hit him, he comes straight back for your throat, and adds a little bit for good measure. So that's the sort of stuff. Business is not just buying and selling shares and what have you. There's a whole range of activities, and so the courts, and in this case, prison, are sort of part of the spectrum of what's going on. There was a very little gap between legitimate business, crooked business, and getting caught. So it really was a place of caveat emptor, of you had to look at what you were buying all the time, and trust no one. Always count every bit of money that comes towards you, so that everything is up for negotiation. It's on the one hand, New York is taking off. At the Erie Canal in the 1820s, New York has become the financial center of America, and the population is just zooming away. So in 1830s, 200,000 people living in New York. It's 500,000 by 1850. So New York is taking off. It's boom and bust. It's rapid expansion. There's this incredible sense of liveliness and stuff on the streets. And Hamilton jumps into this world, embraces it with enthusiasm, and is just that little bit more pushy and ruthless than white people, because he had to be to survive in that world.
And there was tension between Jeremiah and the Black community. Talk about that.
Well, Freedom, right from when we were talking at the beginning about the counterfeit thing, Freedom's journal was unhappy with him, to put it mildly. He doesn't associate with other African Americans, and even he marries a white woman. He doesn't live near blacks. Even his charity cases, like his very good friend Benjamin Day, he has a poor woman living in his house and helps her, but she's white, not African American. His best friend is white. He hangs around with the newspaper people, particularly at the Sun, and is seen walking home from a pub arm in arm with a white man. He doesn't. The other richest black person in New York is a guy called Thomas Downing, who owns an oyster cellar near the corner of Broad Street and Wall Street. And he wouldn't allow African Americans into his oyster cellar. But on the other hand, he wrote checks for the civil rights movement and helped fund the civil rights movement and was involved in various civil rights cases. Mm-hmm. Hamilton wasn't like that. He just doesn't associate with African Americans at all. So every now and again, you get a sort of a moderately scathing comment from one of the African American leaders.
Did he see himself as African American or black?
Sorry?
Did Jeremiah see himself as black, or in terms of the African American part of that community, or culturally?
Not culturally. It's very difficult to see. Most biographies, if you go and read a biography based on diaries, oral histories that allow the author to get inside the head of Jeremiah Hamilton. I have got very few words directly from Jeremiah Hamilton's, just that 15 words probably from Jeremiah Hamilton's. I have to try and work out what he thinks or what he's doing from his actions.
Right.
And so this is difficult. So my guess is that he didn't identify with African Americans at all. And what we have is those occasional things, like he was the person who desegregated Delmonico's, for example, the fancy food emporium / restaurant. And I don't think that was an attempt to desegregate it. So he didn't think about it as desegregating it. He just wanted to behave like his white peers were, and just sort of imperiously strode in there and expected to be served. And so he was aware he was black, and he was. I think he would. And he's married a white woman.
A white girl.
He was when they first got together. She was like 14 years old, and he was in his late 20s. Mm-hmm. Every time he walked down the street in arm with and he ends up, it's a stable relationship that lasts for 40 years. They have 10 children. But every time he walks down the street, arm in arm with her, he's going to be he's waiting for the incident to happen, some sort of racial, because race relations are very sensitive, and there's few things that are more of a red rag to the bull than a black man walking down the street arm in arm with a white woman. So he's aware that that's a red rag to the bull, and I think he was waiting his whole life for some sort of racial incident to it, which eventually it does in the draft rights in 1863.
Start putting your questions in the chat. I'm going to definitely open up the room very soon. I'm curious. I'm always curious about stories of access. And so he was a broker. He was an insurance broker. He owned real estate, Astoria, Poughkeepsie, a mansion in New Jersey, lived on East 29th Street for the remainder of his life. But how does one, and that's a problem even today, how did he access the markets where he was able to buy stocks and be a trader at that point, when all these years later, we're still talking about access?
Again, it's difficult. He had access.
He didn't ask for permission to do much. That's what it sounds like.
He didn't. What we know is he had access, and the interesting access issue was whites trying to get his advice on what stocks to buy. They were sort of scrabbling around, sending him, and we have through one lawsuit, they're sending him cases of champagne and fancy cigars in order to get him to allow them to invest their money with him. So you have this weird thing of a black man in the 1850s and 60s giving advice to whites on what stocks to buy, and many of the stocks are railroad stocks or steamship stocks, when he often wouldn't be allowed on the trains,
right,
or would be segregated off somewhere or other on the boat. And but his advice was seen as being really good. He was a hot person to go in and invest your money with. Now, there's still a crooked element to what he does, in that he had this habit of, if shares went, then the profits was Hamilton, but if shares went down, then his clients socialized the loss, if you will. So and there are disgruntled clients who are going to be suing him in the 1850s and the 1860s. But he becomes more respectable in his old age, so that by the 1860s and the 1870s, he's sort of seen as being, and by then he's one of the older people on Wall Street. He's sort of one of the older sage people that people went to for advice.
Everything wasn't zippity doo dah, because at one point he did lose everything. I mean, he worked to get it back, but talk about that, so that we're not just painting a story where everything was just wonderful, that he had financial issues as well.
Yes, he did. And if we go back to the 1830s, he invested heavily in real estate about a week before the market plunged. His real estate investments would have been fine in the long run if he could have hung on to it. But he was also dealing with buying sugar in the Caribbean, and he had given money to someone else to pay a debt, and that person went bust, and therefore his debt wasn't paid. And so someone else as often happens when the market goes down, someone else failing ended up dragging him down. And for 4 or 5 years there, he's fending off bankruptcy. What actually happens is there are so many bankrupt people in America that the federal government introduces an experimental bankruptcy law for about 12 months in 1841 or 42. And this is very generous to the bankrupt in terms of it's an easy way out, and that's part of the reason it was closed down after 12 months. But on the 5th day that this law is in operation, Hamilton goes bankrupt officially. And what he did, again, as I said, there were so many people going bankrupt, and all the bankrupts' assets were being auctioned off. And so he goes bankrupt and then buys back some of his assets for about $10. So he buys back some of his real estate and stuff. So even the way, the interesting thing here is you would think of the pioneer sort of in any area, sort of feeling around, not quite knowing how it works, but he is operating in the most savvy fashion possible. He is at the clever end of this, of knowing how to exploit this new bankruptcy law in the fashion. And you're in limbo for about 3 months while you're going bankrupt. And from another court case, it appears that he was supposed to be doing no financial transactions. He was actually buying shares under another name, and there was a lawsuit over that. So he's bending the law, he's breaking the law as well. But he's also very sharp, very canny, admirable entrepreneurial skill.
What was his relationship? And we're coming to your questions at 5:45 Eastern. That's 4 minutes now. What was his relationship with Richmond, Virginia?
That's one of the places where he may have been. If he was born in Virginia, he was born there. So one of the interesting things I thought where you have those discoveries when you're an orphan, where you go, oh, wow, I didn't know that. It turns out there's the library in New York in the 18th century was the New York Society Library. The New York Society still exists today up on the Upper East Side. But then it was downtown, down near University Place. And it was a subscription library where you paid money down and then you could go in and take books. And being a sort of a reputable, basically white institution, they kept a record of every book you borrowed. And it turned out he was a member. And so I found a list of, 250 books he borrowed over 20 years. And he borrowed a whole bunch of books about Richmond, particularly during the Civil War. And after Richmond pretty much burns to the ground during the Civil War, a lot of it's burnt. And so there were he had books about Richmond, which to me, again, and it could be a bit of a leap, suggested that if he wasn't born and raised there, if he came from Haiti, he may have spent time in Richmond on the way up to New York. He was interested in what happened there. Whether he ever went there again or not, I don't know. Again, if you're writing a biography of, Lyndon Johnson or someone like that, you're pretty much where he was every day. There are periods of 4 or 5 years. I think he's in New York, but I don't know for certain he is. So he's a slippery character to write about.
Right, and you document, for example, his daughter in the census when she would answer different places where her father was born and so forth. So that just multiply or just adds on to the mystery. But you do know he never returned to Port-au-Prince, correct?
Yeah. No, I assume the sentence of death, that he was sentenced to be shot, that would tend to discourage people. There's another mystery too. Like his name is Jeremiah G. Hamilton, and in all the years I worked on the book, and if you look at his signature, he had this wonderful signature with flourishes and curlicues, and it centers on the G. The G is important to him. He doesn't sign Jerry Hamilton or Jeremiah. It's Jeremiah G. Hamilton. I have got no idea what the G stands for. Even his death certificate, on the instructions on the New York death certificate say fill out his name in full here, and someone has just written in Jeremiah G. Hamilton. It didn't. I have no idea what the G stands for. So if the G were Guillaume or something other like that, that would strongly support him coming from Port-au-Prince or somewhere where French is spoken. But I got no idea, if it's just Gordon or somebody, then that's not so. So I have no idea. So there are still large areas of his life that, because he's an African American who is forgotten by history, that we know nothing about those areas.
On the other side of the questions from our guests, would love to hear you talk about his will. I love that he had a will and what was in it. Who has questions? Please raise your hand, and I think you can actually speak. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, no, yes? Raise your hand if you have any questions, or if you don't want to speak, put your question in the chat. No questions? Okay, so then let's talk about having a will or a trust in this country is one of the most urgent indicators of the transfer of generational wealth or not. Mm-hmm. And so back in the 1800s, Jeremiah G. Hamilton, he had a will. And he and his family lived on East 29th Street. His office, I love the addresses in the book, by the way, Shane. I want to mention next, so when everyone walks past there, you can say, oh yeah, this is where he lived. He worked on Front Street, I believe. And no, I'm sorry, 76 Liberty Street. And then, no, his office is 137 Front Street. But talk about his will. I know that, here's a question. Wait a minute. Did he die with wealth or was he broke? Okay. Claudia wants to know. So talk about his will and the fact that he was trying to hire or pay a white person, a white man to marry his daughter. Talk about all of that.
Well, okay. He has a will, and when he dies, he's reputed to be worth $2 million, which is the equivalent of 200 million nowadays. Which was that fact was a sort of a minor headline in a sort of story. His death is noticed from California to Maine, and the little stories in the newspaper. Richest colored man dies, worth $2 million. There are stories about him. There's a story about him allegedly paying someone to marry his daughter. I don't think that was the case. I think that's sort of a bit of racist claptrap that goes about. There's a lot of resentment in the use of the M word and talking about him. So I doubt that that's the case. One of the interesting things about Hamilton and the family is the extent to which wealth doesn't last in a family. The extent to which, his kids, he dies in 1875 or 6, I can't remember. By 1900, which is when his wife, round about when she dies, there's almost nothing left. So the wealth just, some families, the Rockefellers, have generations and generations of wealth, but there are lots of white families too that were rich, and then the whole lot just sort of disappears. And that sort of happened with Jeremiah Hamilton. His family disappeared, and of all his children, only one of them had children as well. So it died. The family sort of dies out. And when I was writing the book, I got in contact by by a descendant who lived in France, and she had no idea she had a black ancestor. So that the family passed, whether consciously or not, in France, and there's one photograph in the book which is of one of Jeremiah Hamilton's daughter, who was the great grandmother or whatever of the woman who got in touch with me, who has since been to New York and been to Jeremiah Hamilton's grave out in the cemetery.
Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn.
Yes, and so again, as I said, Jeremiah Hamilton was totally unknown, but he's now. I did a Zoom talk with Greenwood Cemetery a few weeks ago, and he's now part of their tour of the famous people buried in Greenwood Cemetery. And so his profile has gone up a little bit because he was, during the 20th century, he was totally expunged from American history. Are we talking about wealth? So when he died, he was wealthy. He was a millionaire, which was rather more important then than it is now, because $1 million was worth a lot more than it is today. But the wealth did not last long in the family. His kids, I think, probably lived off the wealth and ran it down, so that there was no there's no Hamilton University coming out of Jeremiah Hamilton's fortune. There was with some of the famous white families who amassed large sums of money.
Julissa is asking, did his children continue his legacy with interest in the stock market? Any idea what career pursuits they had?
One of his sons was involved in the stock market in a fairly dilettantish fashion. Most of the other children who lived, because several of them die young, very young, as is pretty much the norm for the 19th century, were daughters. And I've got no idea what they did. I had their passport applications in the 1890s, so they were traveling. Some of them were traveling, but so no. And by the 20th century, the only African Americans you're going to find on Wall Street are going to be elevator operators in the skyscrapers. It's going to be a long time until African Americans get to play any sort of a role in the stock market. So he's a pioneer, but there's not much that follows him for a long, long time.
In the limited time we have left with Professor Shane White, please post your questions. What can we learn from Jeremiah G. Hamilton, and why has history largely ignored him? Why can't we find a photo? The photos that are online, everybody, that's not really him. So what can we learn?
Well, I think the reason it was ignored was when I first started working in African American history, and I was working on New York, Americans would sort of look at me and sort of say, I was working on the end of slavery, and they'd sort of look at me and say, slavery in New York? You're just a simple-minded foreigner who doesn't understand things. That has changed, and now people are aware that slavery existed in New York. Even professional historians would sort of look at me, sort of, really? You think you can write a book about that? Now the story pretty much is there was slavery in New York, slavery ended, and blacks were poor and were at the bottom of the heap, and we're waiting for the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and the 1930s before black history becomes interesting. So Jeremiah Hamilton, who is in that period when blacks are poor, is an outlier. He's rich, and so he doesn't fit the pattern. He also doesn't fit the pattern because he's not writing checks for the civil rights movement. He's not involved in black rights, so he doesn't fit into the, he's not like James McCune Smith or various other black activists. So he just doesn't fit. And that means that very quickly after, in the 1850s and 60s, he's well known. But after his death, he's forgotten very, very, very quickly. So in the 20th century, and thanks to Google and digital stuff, an awful lot of print is now searchable online. There are 4 mentions in print of Jeremiah Hamilton in the entire 20th century, and 3 of them have him totally factually incorrect. So he just sort of disappears without trace. What can we learn from Jeremiah Hamilton?
How can we amass a fortune without being corrupt? A little bit of corruption.
Well, a little bit of corruption. A little bit of corruption always helps, whether you're white or black. I think too often African American history is it's either saints or villains. It's either Martin Luther King or it's Nat Turner. And I think there's the full panoply of human life that exists in African American life too often is forgotten about. I think he's in the middle. He's a bit of a villain. He probably was never a saint, and he hoes out a life in New York that is interesting and doesn't fulfill. I love the way he breaks stereotypes, the way he is so aggressive. The stereotype of sexual relations between black and white is usually of white males and black females. If it's the other way around, if it's black males and white females, it's seen as being a fleeting relationship that doesn't last. His lasts for 40 years. And he has 10 children. He begins with a stereotype, a 28-year-old black man getting a 14-year-old white female pregnant, but it doesn't stay a stereotype. It becomes, as far as I know, a loving relationship, definitely one that lasted 40 years and produces that many children. So he's a human being, and looking at his life enables us to get away from some of those stereotypes that to this day bedevil any public discussion of race relations in America.
Touche. Sue's asking, was Jeremiah Freemason?
Not as far as I know. The only thing I could find in joining was the New York Society Library, but I don't think he was. The Masons separate off into black Masons early in the 19th century, and as far as I know, he had nothing to do with them.
Any other association with any organization?
No. He may well have been member of stuff. As I said, he was a member of the New York Society Library, which still exists today. They knew he was a member. They had no idea he was black. So in effect, their first black member of the New York Society was back in 1840s, maybe 50. I can't remember when he starts. But they themselves had no idea. He could well have been a member of other organizations who also didn't know he was the first African American to be a member, and just be there in the records. Again, since I've written the book, every now and again I've stumbled across new little tidbits about him. When he's struggling, going bankrupt in the late 1830s, there's a fire on one of his buildings that he owns up in Poughkeepsie, and it was one of those, I don't know about America, but in Australia, there used to be some streets where fires could take out a building but not touch the buildings on either side, and the insurance claim was already written out so that their insurance. So this was an insurance fire done at 2 o'clock in the morning for $250 was the insurance thing. And as soon as I saw the little story, I said, that's my man. That's Jeremiah Hamilton, sort of stretching the law. No one really minds that much when someone claims a little bit too much on an insurance company. Insurance companies are often seen as being, it's all right to stretch the law just a little bit with insurance claims. A lot of people flirt the law, but burning down a building or sinking a ship is definitely well over the over the law. So every now and again, bits and pieces surface, and I'm hoping sometime somewhere someone's going to come up with a photo. There's probably a painting of him somewhere too. I imagine he would have had a painting done of him that's probably anonymous African American stuck in somewhere, someone's attic or in a museum somewhere, but it's never put on display. Yeah.
We have about 10 remaining minutes. Definitely want to hear your questions or comments, everyone that's joining us. And thank you so much. And Professor Shane White is with us from the University of Sydney in Australia. Thank you so much for getting up so early in Sydney. This is a great conversation. I have 2 questions. It takes, I've written books. It takes a lot of emotional and intellectual energy to focus on one subject or person. Why did you decide to dedicate years in the research and the writing and the editing of this person? And it's a lot, so why? You can choose anyone, why him?
Virtually all of my career, I have written about ordinary African Americans, and what I write about, I'm less interested in the African American middle class or leaders. It's ordinary African Americans. I write about street life, about drinking, about dancing, about music, about sound. I stumbled across Jeremiah Hamilton in reading New York newspapers. I came across a mention, and I thought, it was a reference to M-word Hamilton and a fraud for $50,000. And I thought this was just a story about whites, and it was one of those reprehensible nicknames that you can still find down amongst hedge fund managers down on Wall Street. I remember talking to actually an Indian friend, talking about the Prince of Darkness, and he was aware of Indians who are still, within the last 10 years, referred to as the Prince of Darkness when they're working down, it wasn't Wall Street, it was the financial market somewhere or other else. So I thought, I just took a note of this guy when I was reading in New York, and when I got back to Sydney, I looked up my own research and found I had another reference to this guy, and he was definitely black. So I kept on, once I was aware of his name, I kept on bumping into him over a year or two when I was reading stuff. And I got more and more interested in him and wondered if I could use the techniques I used to write about ordinary African Americans to write about someone who wasn't an ordinary African American. And the turning point came, I was in New York working in the New York Municipal Archives. And on the 7th floor is the New York County Clerk's office. And I went up there, and they have court records and business records. And I went up there, and it's full of lawyers, gophers, and people racing around. And I said, "Have you got anything on Jeremiah Hamilton?" And the guy waves me over and says, "Over there." And there's a index, and I look, and there's no mention. Something was wrong. So I went 6 months later, I went in again and said, "Jeremiah," and he looks at me, and my accent apparently confuses some people. And he said, and he writes down 1910 something rather over there, sort of talking slowly because I'm a foreigner. So I get his pen, I cross out the 1910, and I go 18. He goes, oh, come around here, and he takes me around the corner, and there's a computer that someone's stolen from a museum. It's so old. And he says, what's the guy's name? He types it in, and it turned out they had 35 cases that Jeremiah Hamilton was involved. And as soon as I saw those cases and started reading them, I knew that there was a book there. So my aim was to try and write a book without having an autobiography to help me or a cache of letters that the New York Historical Society had archived away, to write a book about a man who had been totally forgotten. And it was fun. I enjoyed writing it, and of all my stuff that I've written, and I've written a fair bit, it's been the one that's excited the most interest. And people tend to read it and say, why isn't there a film about this guy? Which is a question I ask
you. The last that I heard that Don Cheadle was developing a script. What's going on with development?
I don't know what developing is going on, but he has optioned it, and he just renewed the option a few weeks ago, and he emailed me saying that he's a busy man and he's got lots of different programs to make, but in between he's trying to raise the money and what have you to get someone to finance it, which I think would be fun. I think he would be an interesting person. That's partly the great thing about talking to John Cheadle when he and another actor were sort of bidding for the rights, was he had read the book and read it closely. Often I've been interviewed with people who read the blurb on the back and that's it. He had read the book and knew it in detail and had been thinking about it. So it was, and he's utterly charming. So it was flattering in the extreme. It was a Saturday morning and I was floating on clouds for the rest of the day after talking to him. I think that the great John Cheadle had read my book and enjoyed it. So.
Well, I thank you so much for dedicating your expertise, your scholar, your everything to it, because it's a really brilliant. I have made some conclusions that he was from the Caribbean because, as you say in the book, he was fluent in French, and that may not have happened if he was born in Richmond. But everyone from Richmond, don't send me emails about that. But if there aren't any final questions, again, are there any final questions, everyone? Thank you all for joining us. Anyone, any questions? Where can we reach you? Where can our guests reach you? Our attendees reach you?
Best way to get me is email, and if you just hit Shane White and then the University of Sydney, I've got a page there and you'll see my email number and you can get in touch with me that way.
Sue's, this final question, Sue's asking, if we follow Jeremiah's template path to wealth today, for example, insurance industry and Wall Street, et cetera, would we become wealthy?
Possibly. It's in the lap of the gods, isn't it? You have to remember, he was driven by that desire to be rich, and he would brook no opposition to him, and just sort of rode roughshod over anything that got in his way. So I don't know whether you would need the same determination to become rich that day, but America famously supposedly is the land of opportunity. So quite possibly, yes. I'd certainly urge you to try.
Hello, my name is Sabrina Lamb, and welcome to Planet Wekeza, which means save and invest in Swahili. The mission in Planet Wekeza and Wekeza.com is to provide multilingual financial education and global access to investing in U.S. publicly traded companies. In addition to, or including with, our financial education mission is to understand that financial education, financial security is part of not only our culture as well as the foundation towards our long-term generational support as well as security. So here on this platform, I interview experts from professors to entrepreneurs that can really drive home not only the urgency of this mission, that your own financial security is important, but also to deepen your understanding in the historic ramifications of what's happening and why it is happening. So today, I have the absolute honor of speaking with Professor Justine Hill Edwards. She is, and I have damaged her book. The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank Saving and Trust. Welcome, Professor Edwards.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, for having me. And I love to see the marked up copy of the book.
I have to tell you, this was an absolutely riveting read. It's a page turner. Yes, everyone, you can get the book everywhere, but we're going to take you through this journey and how it relates to now and how it absolutely relates to you in your interaction with financial institutions and or governments. But first, I want to know, Professor Edwards, what is your why? Why did you spend countless hours in detailed research to create this miracle of research?
No, thank you for that. Well, I think my motivations for writing this book came from a few places. One is kind of my hat and my identity as a historian. As I was going through graduate school, doing training in African American history and training to be a historian of slavery, part of that training, of course, is learning about the history of the Civil War and the history of Reconstruction. And I had read a little bit about the Freedmen's Bank, but not much. And so when I was finishing my PhD in 2015 and in 2016, starting to think about turning the work that I was doing into my first book and thinking about what I may want to do for my second book, this is around the time when the Treasury Department approved of erecting a plaque on the facade of the Treasury Annex. And so that plaque briefly details the history of the Freedmen's Bank. And so kind of going back and thinking about the Freedmen's Bank, I started to do as many scholars do. They kind of go and look at what other scholars and historians have written about the particular topic. And I was surprised that in 2016, there were only two other books about the Freedmen's Bank, one published in 1976 and the other one published in 1924. And there were a handful of scholarly journal articles, but I was surprised at the fact that there wasn't more work done on the Freedmen's Bank. And so that was one part. The other part is that I consider myself to be a historian of Black economic life in America. And so kind of pairing that with studying the histories of slavery, I saw that the history of the Freedmen's Bank could be really instructive in helping me understand the longer trajectory of topics that continue to have political significance today, the racial wealth gap, the kind of talking about racial economic inequality. And so I thought that studying this period of Reconstruction when slavery ends, and studying that through the history of the Freedmen's Bank would be a really interesting way to better understand these longer conversations about wealth and racial inequality that we continue to have in America today.
Right. So let's have another person or spirit join this conversation.
Sure.
Think about the Black people, the newly freed Black people who sat through presentations by different people, historical figures, and we'll talk about who they are, and asked very, very astute questions in terms, how safe will our money be? He was referred to as an old man. Let's call him John.
Sure.
Mr. John. Let's have him here, because the spirits of our ancestors still live with us today. And there's a lot of repetition, or the continuing narratives that happened during this time in the 1800s, everyone, that still continue today. So someone is continuing the story, and I want to lift them up. So the Black people are newly freed, okay? And so then they're trying to navigate, what does this freedom mean, and how they can have some security, some access to not politically, but also access to land. But then they were also trying to figure out, particularly those who served in the Union Army, trying to find out, where do I save? Where does my money? How can I keep my money safe? And many gave their money to the generals or whomever they were serving with to hold their money. Could you talk about how, coming out of slavery, and then kind of peaked back up with Reconstruction, but how Black people navigated earning and managing their money as newly freed people?
Sure. Well, I mean, an important part of this story is that, so the Freedmen's Bank was established on March 3rd, 1865. And part of this kind of longer story of the history of the Freedmen's Bank and the African-American depositors was that the Freedmen's Bank was kind of evolved out of the establishment of 3 military savings banks for Black soldiers in 1864. And so essentially, Black soldiers were serving in the Union Army, and they were making money, sometimes on par with their white counterparts. And they were struggling with not really what to do with their money, but how to keep their money safe. Many of them wanted to send their money back to their wives and children. And so we have 3 Union generals established 3 military savings banks for Black soldiers, one in Norfolk, Virginia, one in Beaufort, South Carolina, and one in New Orleans, Louisiana. And so these military savings banks were actually fairly successful, such that by December of 1864, the 2 military banks in Norfolk and in Beaufort had accrued about $200,000 in Black soldiers' pay, which was kind of outstanding. And so what these banks showed to white Northerners, and what they showed to kind of the banking interests in the country at this time, was that African Americans were an untapped market, an untapped consumer for financial services. And what this showed, I think, what it kind of showed for African Americans was that they were coming out of this period of slavery into this new but kind of unstable period of freedom with an economic power. But this was not surprising to them. And this is what I talk about in my first book on free markets, where I look at the economic and financial activities of the enslaved in South Carolina. And what I show there is that African Americans, especially those who were enslaved, had been developing ideas of money, of finance for generations. They were trading among themselves. They were selling goods to their enslavers and other poor whites. And so they were armed with particular understandings of money, of the benefits of savings. And these ideas were not new. And so African Americans came to the Freedmen's Bank excited about saving money, excited about the prospect of saving enough money for what they really wanted and needed. One that was to relocate and to find members of their families. But importantly, secondly, was the opportunity to buy land. And so property ownership, land ownership was fundamentally important to African Americans as they were coming out of slavery into this new period of freedom. And they engaged with the Freedmen's Bank to help them meet that goal.
Mm-hmm. And this was led because the so-called opportunity with the Freedmen's Bank was brought to their attention by a Christian minister,
Yeah.
Alvord. Would you talk about his role in the raising awareness, the advocacy regarding the bank for the formerly enslaved to deposit their monies into this new institution that was just for them?
Mm-hmm. Well, John Alvord was a white abolitionist minister from New Jersey. And in 1864, he was working as an attaché with the Union Army. And so during this period of time, he was taking the opportunity to speak to as many African Americans as possible. He wanted to know what their lives were like in slavery, and importantly, he wanted to know kind of their goals and aspirations for this new period of freedom. And so overwhelmingly, they told him that they wanted access to land and the opportunity to buy land and buy property. And so he took this idea of creating a savings bank for African Americans because he saw the success of these three military savings banks. And so in January of 1865, he travels to New York and he gathers a group of white abolitionists, politicians, philanthropists, bankers, and he introduces the idea of creating the Freedman Savings and Trust Company to serve the financial needs of the nation's recently emancipated African Americans, the almost 4 million of whom were kind of, again, coming into this new period of freedom. And so this was a popular idea. He gained popular support from, again, some of the nation's most important bankers and philanthropists in the North. They traveled to DC shortly thereafter and gained congressional approval for this bank. And so on March 3rd, 1865, Lincoln signs the Freedmen's Bank Act, and it is seen as being kind of Lincoln's gift to African Americans in this new period of freedom, creating a savings bank just for them.
Okay, so he went and he started to gather other trustees. Most of them were white Northerners, they were wealthy and so forth. Was the initial intention of the foundation or the founding of the bank truly philanthropic?
Yeah, it was established as a benevolent financial institution. And the Freedmen's Bank was not the first bank created under this idea. The 19th century saw the establishment of savings banks created by white philanthropists, especially in cities like Philadelphia and New York and Boston, to help the poor members of those cities kind of save money to help themselves get out of poverty. And so the idea of creating a savings bank for African Americans was kind of founded under this idea of safe savings banking being a cure for poverty. The Freedmen's Bank, though, was established as a simple savings bank. It was established to only receive deposits of former slaves, to invest a third of those deposits in government securities, and so a very kind of low risk financial product. And the Freedmen's Bank was supposed to operate with the least amount of risk possible, again, to protect the financial interests of African Americans. And so the fact that the Freedmen's Bank was so popular and grew relatively quickly, especially in its first 5 years, was a testament to those benevolent foundations, but also to the economic power of African Americans as, again, they were coming out of slavery, such that in the first 3 years, by 1868, African Americans had put about $3.5 million into their bank accounts, which is, again, staggering. Today, that would be about $76.1 million. And again, I think it's so fascinating and so important that we're talking about a population of recently emancipated African Americans who are putting millions of dollars into these bank accounts collectively.
If you could also share the financial behaviors of African Americans during that time in the 1800s vis-a-vis their bank accounts. Did they make those deposits for long-term savings, or did they kind of use it sort of a checking or a debit to save enough money and then to go and purchase land, for example?
Sabrina, that's such an important topic and question because that fundamentally was a misalignment between African Americans and the bank's white administrators. African Americans were using the Freedmen's Bank and putting money in their bank accounts to keep their money safe for a short period of time, because what they really wanted to do was save enough money, withdraw that money, and buy land, buy machinery, buy livestock. That's really what they wanted the bank to help them do, simply to save money for a short period of time. The bank's white administrators wanted African Americans to put their money in the bank and essentially keep it there to allow for the bank's investment in securities to pay off. And so essentially, there became clear that there was a misalignment between what the bank's white administrators wanted African Americans to do with their money, which was leave it in the bank, versus what African Americans wanted to do, which was to make money, to earn money, to put money in their bank accounts and then withdraw it when they had enough to buy land. And so that was a very early kind of reflection of the ways in which the African American depositors and white bank administrators were really misaligned in terms of their goals.
And the other misalignment was the paternalism that you talk about, because in the 1800s, Black people were demanding to have some. Can we have Black cashiers in the bank, in the branches? Why can't we work here? Or why can't we be a treasurer here? Could you share what you deemed as a paternalistic approach to the Black depositors and their accounts and the bank?
Well, African Americans were really not involved in the bank's administration, both kind of in the board of trustees or kind of running individual bank branches. And that became a problem. The first Black trustees didn't join the board until 1867, and they weren't really as involved in the bank's kind of administration or operation. And increasingly, African Americans wanted to see Black cashiers, Black bank managers in their branches. And there was kind of pushback from white bank administrators saying that I'm not sure if we can really trust African Americans to run these bank branches. And so that was also a misalignment. There subsequently became more branch cashiers after the 1870s. Specifically, one of the more prominent Black cashiers was in New Orleans, and he was a biracial Black man named C.S. Salvin. And so he was one of the more prominent of the Black cashiers. But there have been kind of conversations among scholars calling the Freedmen's Bank a Black bank, and this is kind of one of the reasons why I don't believe that it was, because first and foremost, a majority of the bank's berators and administrators and managers were white.
Charlie McKinney asked, did the philanthropists and abolitionists really want financial freedom for Black people? But they wanted the Black folks, though. They wanted their money. Okay.
Well, I think it's a good question, right? And the idea of the Freedmen's Bank as being a philanthropic venture, I think, was really important. I think the reality was that the majority of the bank's administrators, the bank's white administrators, were involved in the bank's management because they liked the idea of being involved in it, not because they were necessarily really supportive of the bank kind of growing and expanding and ultimately benefiting African Americans. And that was part of the bank's fundamental problem. Because the bank's administrators, even members of Congress, I don't think took seriously enough the fact that African Americans were really enthusiastic about patronizing this bank, about putting their hard-earned savings into their bank accounts. They took their investment and their involvement in the bank incredibly seriously, and I don't think that the bank's white administrators took their involvement as seriously as African Americans did.
As well as you write in research in the book, Congress didn't even take their oversight seriously.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of words that are really important I want everyone to hang on that Professor and Dr. Edward shared. She talked about the role of the bank, the Friedman's Bank was a savings bank. And we're going to pivot on that. But also where the oversight was not, there was no regulatory oversight that is kind of common here, but sometimes there's some missteps. But if you could address that, please.
Sure. Well, we are kind of operating in a period of time when the first financial regulator was created. And so the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency was established in February of 1863. And the comptroller was made responsible for kind of regulating national banks and forcing the transition of state banks to a national banking framework and solidifying the use of one currency. Prior to this, banks could issue their own currencies, which was a crazy renegade period in American history in terms of American finance. And so the comptroller was supposed to be made responsible for regulating the Freedmen's Bank. However, when Congress approved of creating the bank and when Lincoln signed the bank into existence, the Freedmen's Bank was not under the jurisdiction of the comptroller. Instead, the Congress was supposed to regulate and therefore examine the bank. And I think that that was a really important distinction. And it goes back to my previous comment in that I don't think that members of Congress were really taking seriously the fact that, one, the bank would grow so quickly, and that, two, African Americans would put so much money in their bank accounts. I think if they had taken African American participation in the Freedmen's Bank as seriously as they should have, then they would have shifted regulation and examination to the comptroller sooner than they did.
And according to the bank's charter, and everyone, this is so important, the foundation of this institution and any institution, according to the bank's charter, there were not to be any loans of depositors' money, particularly by the trustees.
Yes, exactly. I will answer a question. The FDIC was not yet created. And so the fact that the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency was really the first and the major regulator here was important. But yes, I mean, it is fascinating that we are talking about a period too where banking is still in this renegade period. There's not a lot of regulation. In many ways, corruption was seen as kind of a part of doing business in this period. And so the Freedmen's Bank was kind of open to plunder because of the sheer structure of banking in this period. But according to the bank's original charter, the bank was not supposed to make loans because, of course, it was a savings bank, and loan making was seen as being incredibly risky, which it was. And so that's why when the Freedmen's Bank charter was established, no lending was supposed to happen under the regulations outlined by Congress and signed by Lincoln.
However, because they had lobbied Congress and these were their friends and so forth, that may have been another reason. But, you know, they were going all across the country. Well, I don't know about all across the country, but in the North and the South. And then ads for the Freedmen's Bank would appear in Black newspapers. For example, the Freedmen Saving Bank, come one, come all, and deposit your money in one among the best institutions in the United States, and thereby save your money and get the interest. So wrote the colored Tennessean, May 24th, 1866.
Yeah, I mean, the bank's marketing strategy was direct and it was aggressive. The bank's administrators were advertising in some of the most prominent Black newspapers in the South and in the North and Mid Atlantic. And they were very strategic in the language that they used, saying to forego tobacco and forego liquor and fancy clothing and jewelry, and instead put your money in your Freedman's bank account. To a penny saved is a penny earned, or if you put this amount of money in your Freedman's bank account now, it will grow to be this amount of money in 2 years. This was one of the best institutions that Lincoln supported in the aftermath of the war. That to be fully participating citizens in this American republic, you will embrace the responsibility of banking and saving. And so connecting participation in the Freedmen's Bank to citizenship, especially in this new period of freedom, was incredibly important for the bank's administrators. And increasingly, it was incredibly convincing to African Americans who began to really absorb these messages. And even men like Frederick Douglass were publicly supportive of the bank for this reason, because he believed that if African Americans could show their fiscal responsibility, that white Americans would be more accepting of their inclusion in the body politic, which was a message that ultimately did not yield the type of results that he hoped, unfortunately.
And unfortunately, his support may have been less so if he knew what was happening, how fragile the finances were behind the scenes. Okay, so the Union, the Civil War has kind of ended, and then this whole issue, and throughout generations, Black families talk about, the 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah.
Would you please address this? Because it's my view that there was a kind of a promise, but it was for the formerly enslaved people in about 3 states. Mm-hmm. Georgia, South Carolina, and maybe one another, but it was an order that was issued. And then what happened to that order to give those formerly enslaved land? So we can put this 40 acres and a mule promise with just some more transparency, I think.
Sure. Well, it is called Special Field Order number 15, and it was signed into law by Union General William T. Sherman. And it was created to provide land to the formerly enslaved between South Carolina and northern Florida. And so this order was supposed to provide 400,000 acres of prime coastal land to the formerly enslaved for a few reasons. One, to kind of help them begin this new period of freedom with land. Two, to encourage former Confederates to defect, because Sherman was giving this land that was formerly owned by Confederates to the formerly enslaved. And 3, importantly, Sherman was not doing this out of some moral compulsion, right? He was actually very violent towards communities of African Americans. When he would kind of go through these communities in the Confederate South, there would be thousands of African Americans formerly enslaved who would follow him and his army. And he did not like that. And so he was trying to separate them, to segregate them from white soldiers as they were kind of marching through the South on their military campaign. And so Special Field Order number 15 was to kind of separate African Americans from whites in the South at this point. But what it did for African Americans was it provided them with 40-acre plots of land. And it was supposed to, again, help them in this new period, in this transition to freedom. Now, subsequently, when Lincoln was assassinated and President Andrew Johnson kind of arises into this role as president, in the fall of 1865, he rescinds it. and African Americans are divested of this land. And so 1865 in this period is so important for African Americans because we see this great promise of freedom, this great promise of land, but it is almost immediately rescinded once Johnson comes into president that fall.
And President Johnson also forgave pardon. Where does that word come up? Pardon the former Confederate soldiers and gave the land back to them after the Black people had been promised and were starting to build their lives on that land. And was it Alfred or who visited Ediston Island and met with the community of Black people? We're talking 1800s, everyone.
I believe it was Saxton, who was at this point the Secretary of War.
To explain that's not going to happen.
Yes. And so he goes to South Carolina and he meets with communities of African Americans. And he is given the responsibility of telling them that they no longer have legal claims to this land. And I even think he realized what a challenging responsibility he had, right? Because he had witnessed African Americans building communities on this land, and so he's forced to give out this horrible news. And of course, African Americans are upset; they're angry because we might even say that the land was an initial form of reparations for generations of violence, of forced labor, of family separation, and so this period is again a period of great promise, but great tragedy because African Americans are experiencing this new period of freedom, but really not having the direct support of the federal government in making their claims to freedom in these very tangible ways, which is land.
And as we entered the Reconstruction era, and as Black people were supporting the Freedmen's Bank, they experienced widespread violence in response because of white fears and anger to their exercising or determination to exercise their economic rights.
Absolutely. In states like Louisiana and Texas, there were dramatic upticks of racial violence where white Americans and former Confederates were taking out their frustrations with losing the war on African Americans themselves. And so we see these moments of essentially race riots where white Americans are terrorizing Black communities in this period. And so while I might say that the history of the Freedmen's Bank is could be seen as a one of promise, right? African Americans really displaying and demonstrating their economic fitness for freedom. They're also under the constant fear of white violence in this period, and that violence continues past Reconstruction into the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay, let's go back to the office, back to the bank. Because Alfred, because he was Minister Alvord. Am I pronouncing his name correctly? Alvord. Alvord. So Minister Alfred was saying, I'm under a lot of stress trying to manage all my professional responsibilities.
Yes.
I think we should move the bank from New York, and it was on Cedar Street, everyone, from Cedar Street to Washington, D.C., and we also need to recruit some new trustees.
Yes.
Where did how did Jay and Henry Cook figure into all of this history?
Sure. Well, 1867, 2 years into the bank's operation, was a very important year. Prior to this, the bank's main office was in New York, and that's because that's where the majority of the trustees lived and worked. But Alvord, who again was the bank's founder, at this point, I think he's the second vice president of the bank. He introduces the idea of moving the Freedmen's Bank main office from New York to DC. He says that it means that the bank will be closer to a broader hub of African Americans, but importantly closer to Congress and the federal government. And so he gets approval for this, but around the same time, it's really in the spring of 1867 when this happens. A handful of board members drop off, and Alvord introduces a new crop of trustees who will fundamentally change the bank's operational structure. The most important of whom was Henry Cook. Now, Henry Cook was a banker. He and his brother Jay Cook ran the most valuable and important investment firm, the first investment firm in America, Jay Cook and Company. And at the time, Henry Cook was the president of First National Bank, which was the DC branch of Jay Cook and Company. Now, Henry Cook was incredibly well connected. He and his brother were. They were close personal friends with Lincoln because during the war, they together had raised about $1 billion for the war effort. And at this time, they became incredibly wealthy. They were also close personal friends with Treasury Secretary and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase. They were also friends with Grant, who would become president in 1870. And so they were very tightly connected, well connected to many of the major political and economic players in the nation at this period of time. And so when he joins the Board of Trustees in the spring of 1867, he brings a cohort of men with him who support his financial and political goals. The most important of which was to begin to lobby members of Congress to change the bank's charter. So again, the bank is a savings bank. It's not supposed to make loans. Henry Cook believes that he and his business partners could potentially benefit financially if the bank started to make loans, because he saw millions of dollars of African Americans' money just sitting in bank accounts. Interestingly enough, it is around the same time that the bank makes its first illegal loan. And so on April 19th, 1867, a man named D.L. Eaton takes a loan for $1,000.
Cook's friend.
Yes, Cook's friend.
Who became the board of, he was a member of the Board of Trustees brought in by Cook.
Yes.
Okay. And yeah, so he was recruited, so to speak, by Cook, because as you write in the book, because Cook thought, or may have thought, well, he's not going to challenge anything.
Exactly. Right. And he could potentially benefit from being in this position.
And did.
And so Eaton takes the first loan, $1,000. It's an illegal loan. He pays it back. But importantly, 2 weeks later, he signs on to be the bank's actuary, which is the person who is supposed to evaluate the risk profile of the bank's investment portfolio. And so I say that it is only 2 years into the bank's operation that corruption really starts to seep in. And from there, the bank makes almost $100,000 in illegal loans between 1867 and when Congress actually approves of amending the bank's charter in May of 1870. And importantly, Henry Cook is the chairman of the Finance Committee, which was the committee on the Board of Trustees responsible for maintaining the bank's investments. And so it is in this period, only 2 years after the bank begins operation, that the bank makes a legal loan, shifts its main office, brings on trustees who are really interested in kind of chipping away at the bank's benevolent and philanthropic foundations. And that's exactly what happens.
And according to your detailed research in the book, they knew, most people close to that knew the fragile financial position that the bank was in at that time. But the bank trustees led by Cook thought it would be a great idea to buy land in Washington to build a new cathedral gold, trim building in Washington. In fact, the New York Times wrote at that time in the 1800s, please tell us what year that was, said, this is a crazy idea.
Yes.
I'm paraphrasing, okay?
Yes, I believe it was in 1869 or 1870. The bank's board of trustees buys a fabulous new building. It was adjacent to the White House and Treasury, which was important, and so it was prime real estate. And they spend $260,000 on the renovations. They spared no expense. There's beautiful furniture. They use black walnut and marble. Frederick Douglass writes that he is astounded at how opulent the building was. But what it meant was that the bank's white trustees were prioritizing what the bank looked like, while the bank's black depositors really didn't care about what the bank's main office looked like. They wanted to make sure that their money was safe. And so again, we see the bank's white administrators really start to not chip away by this point, but hammer away at the bank's philanthropic foundations.
That's right. And then they continued to make those kind of so-called loans. The trustees would loan their friends, like, oh, Bob, I don't know if there was a Bob during that time. Bob, do you need a loan?
Robert,
Robert, Robert, do you need a loan? And they would give these loans, but the black depositors with their own money face far more denials or reviews, than the white loan applicants.
Yes, I mean it got to a point where African Americans were really questioning why they couldn't get loans, and they knew that the DC branch was giving out millions of dollars in loans to white borrowers who had personal or professional ties and connections to the bank's white members of the board of trustees. And so we are talking about Henry Cook taking out at least $500,000 in loans from the bank. We're talking about the bank's architect getting loans from the bank. Interestingly, though, Howard University got about $125,000 in loans negotiated by Howard's founder, General O.O. Howard. Howard and Alvord had become very close in 1865 and 1866 because they worked together at the Freedmen's Bureau. And so it is kind of fascinating, the kind of network of businessmen, of politicians who were getting loans from the bank, while a very, very small percentage of that loan volume went to African Americans. And we're talking about mostly Black churches and institutions in and around DC. But in the grand scheme of things, we find out that by 1874, when the bank collapses, about 95% of the loan volume went to whites in and around DC, which meant that only about 5% went to African Americans, and those were essentially a handful of Black churches.
Looks like you have a former student missing your classes these days.
I wonder who this is.
Are these monetary values you're citing adjusted for today's inflation? She does.
Yes, that is in the book. And so one of the figures that I cite quite regularly is that by 1874, African Americans had put about $57 million in the bank. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be about $1.5 billion.
Did the bank grow too fast at its heyday? How many states or cities was it located in, and did it grow too fast?
Yes, I think it did grow too fast for a variety of reasons. But at its heyday, at its height, by 1872, there were 37 branches across 17 states, and so we have as far north as New York and Philadelphia, as far south as Tallahassee, Florida, and as far west as St. Louis, Missouri. There were, interestingly, proposed branches in Texas, in Houston, and in Galveston, but at the time, specifically in 1866 and 67, the bank's white administrators said that they could not establish branches there because of the rise of racial violence in those two places. And so the bank actually could have spread out more, but we also do need to account for this is still a period of racial violence and clashes, especially in the former Confederate South. But the bank spread fairly quickly, such that by March of 1866, there were about 19 branches, which was kind of astounding, right? And the problem was that the bank's administrators were not being judicious about how they were spending depositors' money. Instead of renting bank branch buildings, they were buying buildings outright.
Right.
They were not necessarily training the bank's cashiers.
Or
And
paying the cashiers.
yes, and so there were kind of back and forth between how much cashiers would be paid based on kind of where the branches were. And so the bank spread very quickly. And so while African Americans were continuing to put lots of millions of dollars in the bank's administrators were not being as judicious as they should have been. And kind of throwing into this, the bank's main office was lending millions of dollars. And so we are talking about a situation that could have been helped if there was perhaps a regulator to do its job. But the first examination actually does not happen until February of 1873. And that's when Congress mandates that the comptroller send out examiners to examine the Freedmen's Bank. And what the examiner finds is that the bank is essentially insolvent. Branch cashiers are really not being trained as well as they should have been. The bank's finance committee is not doing its due diligence in terms of making sure that the loans that they do make have adequate collateral. And so the bank is insolvent, it's upside down, and financially it is really not doing well.
We're coming up on time, but if you could just address this issue, how pivotal was it towards the bank's collapse of those investments in railroads by Henry and J. Cook?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a period of time when the federal government and private investors are investing millions of dollars into the construction of a transcontinental railroad. And one of those projects was the Northern Pacific Railroad. And so the Cook brothers were made responsible for raising capital for this project, and they were having a hard time. They couldn't find investors both domestically and internationally in Western Europe. And so what happens is that in the beginning of 1873, they start to prepare for bankruptcy. That subsequently happens in September of 1873, and it sparks what's called the Panic of 1873, which is a financial depression. And so what do bank depositors do? They make runs on their bank branches, because they want their money. And so, as we know too, I mean, runs on bank kind of increases the level of instability, because most banks don't have that much capital or cash, right? They send their money to the main branch or invested or what have you. And so this kind of, again, continues to chip away at the bank. And so the failure of this railroad project kind of pushes the Freedmen's Bank further to insolvency. And that is essentially what happens with the second comptroller examination in February of 1874. It is an even more damning examination, and that is made public. And so by this time, John Alvord is the bank's president. He becomes the bank's president in 1868. A small but vocal group of trustees start to push him out and say that he's really not done a good job. He's allowed for the Cook brothers to come and pillage the bank. And so John Alvord resigns. And then in March of 1874, they ask and invite Frederick Douglass to be the bank's last president. He says yes, he becomes the president. He looks at the bank's finances and realizes that they're upside down and that the bank is completely insolvent. And he is entering this position to essentially be the president of the Freedmen's Bank when it fails. And that's exactly what happens on July 2nd, 1874.
So in order to find out were the Black depositors, of course, they got their money back. And what happened to? Well, no, you can't answer. You can't answer, Professor Cook. All right, because Professor Cook, Professor. And of course, Henry and Jay Cook, they all went to prison, or did they? What happened, and why was Frederick Douglass brought in, and what was his response to it? But I do want you to. They have to read the book.
Yes.
Okay.
You're gonna have to read the book.
Yours looks prettier than mine. So, the final question here on Planet Wekeza, and thank you for being here, Professor Dr. Justine Hill Edwards. How does this issue, this emotion regarding trust, permeate our community from the time we've set on the shores of North America?
Mm-hmm.
How and why does it continue to permeate as it relates to our feeling towards government institutions and financial institutions, and what can we do today because you have to keep your money safe. We do have the FDIC now.
Yeah.
How should Black America and Black people throughout the African diaspora feel about engaging and trusting financial institutions?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that I think we have to understand that we have to be proper stewards of our money, but that's not new. It's not like African Americans and people of African descent need to be told that. We know that. And so I often think that much of the conversations about financial inclusion and the racial wealth gap put a disproportionate amount of responsibility on Black communities, without taking into consideration the historical and generational injustices that the financial services industry has waged on Black communities. And it is an inherited and generational trauma that I think we are not talking about quite enough. I think that, yes, financial literacy is incredibly important, but I think one of the lessons of the Freedmen's Bank was that African Americans were doing everything that they were supposed to do. The recently emancipated were doing everything that they were supposed to do. They were working, they were earning wages, they were saving, they were buying property, they were trying to protect their property and their families, and they still were not protected. And so this is why there is a disproportionate lack of trust in traditional financial institutions. I think that the work that you are doing is so instrumental in kind of teaching our community, both here and internationally, that that we have this economic power, and this is what we need to do with it. We need to be proper stewards of our own financial future, and so I think that understanding where that distrust comes from and really appreciating it too, right? Like African Americans, people of color, people of African descent, perhaps disproportionately don't trust traditional finance and traditional banks for specific reasons. And to, I think, appreciate that is incredibly important, but still figuring out ways to build up our own communities financially is incredibly important.
Thank you. How can everyone reach you? Where can everyone purchase the book?
You can purchase Savings and Trust at your local booksellers or online. And you can find me at JustineHillEdwards.com.
Professor and Dr. Justine Hill Edwards, author of The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank Savings and Trust. Thank you so much for joining me here on Planet Wekeza.
Thank you for having me, Sabrina.
Can you envision a world where you and your family in America and those who immigrated from Africa and the Caribbean could receive immersive financial education traded companies in that time has come? Wekeza. Finally, from your mobile phone, you can start investing in building wealth. Wekeza. Just sign up for the Wekeza app and join the Wekeza community to receive ongoing adult and youth financial education from licensed advisors. Wekeza. You become a financially educated and protected investor. Wekeza has one empowering objective: creating financial inclusion and your family's generational wealth for the African diaspora. Wekeza.
And hello and welcome back to Planet Wekeza. What does Wekeza mean? It means save and invest in Swahili. Hello, I'm Sabrina Lamb, the founder and CEO of Wekeza, as well as World of Money, the leading provider of youth financial education for ages 7 to 18 in the United States and 4 African countries. Here at Wekeza, we have very important, crucial, urgent conversations moving wealth, business, entrepreneurship, finances into and front and center in our lives, because financial education and wealth building is part of the African diaspora and culture. Today, we uncover the history behind America's racial wealth gap with Arizona State History Professor Calvin Schermerhorn, a leading expert on the economic history of race in America. His new book, which debuts today, The Plunder of Black America: How the Racial Wealth Gap was Made. He reveals how Black Americans were systematically dispossessed of wealth, not through mismanagement, but through deliberate exclusion. From the early days of enslavement to modern policies like redlining and predatory lending, each shift in the American economy has denied Black communities the ability to build generational prosperity. Through powerful stories like Anthony Johnson, a Black landowner whose property was stolen in colonial Virginia, and how the thief that stole the land, how their descendants have prospered, and the destruction of Tulsa's Black Wall Street. Professor Schermerhorn connects historical injustices to modern day financial inequality. Welcome, Professor Schermerhorn, to Planet Wekeza.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So my first question to you is why? Why have you dedicated your professional life to center on this subject, slavery, economic injustices as it relates to capitalism? Why this subject?
Why this subject? Thank you. When I was growing up in a military family, we moved from an air base in Germany to Southern Maryland in 1984. Before that, I was on an air base in Britain. And what I saw when I went to elementary school was a puzzle. Why was it that William's father picked up a mop and a bucket when he went to work? And why did my father pick up a briefcase? Why did Rhonda's mother have a service job? Why did my mother teach school? And it wasn't because of an absence of African-American professionals. Both my teacher and the principal were African-American women. But there was something about this environment in Southern Maryland that seemed to hide a story that nobody wanted to acknowledge. And as I went to high school, I went to college in that place, the story became more mysterious. I actually lived down the road. I didn't know it at the time, but I lived it right down the road from where some of the Georgetown enslaved people who were taken from Maryland and sold to Louisiana to keep Georgetown afloat in 1838, where they lived in St. Inigo's, Maryland. There were clues in the landscape. And so when I got interested in history, it was to try and uncover those clues. When I read Frederick Douglass, I thought, how many more Frederick Douglasses were out there whose voices did not reach our ears? And so as a historian, as a professional, I looked into the origins of enslavement in the Chesapeake, and then got interested in the afterlives of enslavement. And that's when things got interesting, because the historians will say, all right, well, here's this process of enslavement, and then what we have on the other side is freedom. But I think what we need were bigger categories than that, because freedom presupposes a little bit of economic fairness too, right? We talk about free markets, we talk about a free economy. This is supposed to be the fertile ground in which opportunity grows. So why hasn't it grown for African Americans? Of course, we can look at the history of Jim Crow and the history of systematic exclusions. But then people think there's a civil rights movement. That's 50 years in the past now. Shouldn't that have righted things? And so that piqued my interest. And so when we're thinking about issues of wealth and generational wealth, and how it takes a long time to build wealth, it can take a very short time to destroy wealth, those questions interest me. And so the Plunder of Black America is an attempt to go back and reconstruct that story through several African American families over that long period of time, to see how that process works and how that history fits together.
Thank you for that. And I'm always curious about word usage. I rarely hear the word plunder. And as you indicated in the book, that you use that word, or you were inspired to include that word from a quote from Frederick Douglass, who said once, "Men who live by robbing their fellow men of their labor and liberty have forfeited their right to know anything of the thoughts, feelings, or purposes of those whom they rob and plunder."
Correct.
Why did you use the word plunder?
Plunder gets to the heart of the matter. Plunder suggests ill usage. This is why Ta-Nehisi Coates' his work is so powerful when he uses the plunder of Black life. This is why Frederick Douglass's work is so powerful when he uses this word. We may think of an act like an act of piracy, of plunder. You can associate it with kind of the Caribbean golden age of piracy. But what we're talking about when we talk about the plunder of intergenerational wealth are many, sometimes loud, but mostly quiet acts: dispossession, disinheritance, decapitalization. The plunder can be as silent as an algorithm that denies credit to someone who deserves credit, but for whom the algorithm has trained to recognize this person as someone who has to pay more for that. That's an instance of plunder. Now we think, well, okay, that has maybe nothing to do with an overseer on a plantation holding a firearm or a whip and commanding obedience. But if we connect the process of wealth stripping, of the often violent and sometimes quiet method of denying income generating possibilities, and if we set those things up, then we can start to see the big picture. And that we have something more than just, well, there was slavery and then stopped. And then we have freedom. And then we have Jim Crow, but that stopped. And now we have freedom. And so in the Plunder of Black America, I try to look at those places where Black families have recognized the obstacles and tried to overcome them.
And we're going to talk about the 8 families that you heavily research. I have my book here. It's dog-eared and Post-its and red and yellow highlights all the way through it. How and why did you choose Mary and Anthony Johnson? I want to lift their names. Venture, his name was Venture, and Meg Smith. Morris, Martha Bentley, Harriet and Jack Adams, the Rivers family, the Ragsdale, the Praters. When there were so many silent plunders, why did you choose those? And they all kind of were around the area that you grew up in, that Maryland, Washington, D.C., Virginia area, although Harriet, she went to Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Correct. When I was doing research for this book, I wanted it to be more than just bad things happen. Okay, so what I was looking for were families who strove to overcome an obstacle only to see another obstacle spring up in their place. And so we start with Mary and Anthony Johnson. These were their adopted names on the eastern shore of Virginia. They were young people in what's today Angola, who were captured, taken down the Kwanzaa River Valley, branded by Portuguese merchants and sold to enslavers, taken on a slave ship across the Atlantic, who was intercepted by English pirates. And they landed in Virginia near the startup phase of the Virginia Project. And before a law of slavery, they were somewhere between a captive and an indentured servant. They'd never signed an indenture. They never agreed to be there, unlike so many other indentured servants. But they found a way out of no way. So faced with a high mortality rate, a very hostile environment, they somehow learned to earn income and generate wealth. And I think they did that by ranching livestock. And over years and years of ranching their own livestock, even while enslaved, they built up a nest egg. They moved to Virginia's eastern shore, and they traded their livestock for bound laborers, which meant land, and became tobacco planters. And so for a moment in the 1650s, here were Angolan, Kimbundu-speaking planters on the eastern shore of Virginia who were suing their white neighbors and winning in court when courts decided that the status of this family was more important than their appearance. Then they ran into obstacles. The British government, the Crown, the Parliament decided to change the rules of the colonial game and squeeze the colonists by making them export their tobacco directly to England rather than on the free market. And then their neighbors started buying other Angolans, other Kimbundu speakers from New Amsterdam, from Dutch merchants. And so all of a sudden, you look around, people who look like the Johnsons are now enslaved, and the colony starts to associate race with enslavement and starts to exclude them from the rights and privileges that they'd earned in the colony. So that by the time the patriarch Anthony Johnson died in 1670, he died without a will. The court decided that he was a Negro and by consequence an alien. That's the quote that they used. And that was the jurisprudence that allowed them to take his property. When just about everybody else in the colony who died without a will, they said, where's the nearest relative? Let's give that property to them. So the Johnsons had to essentially become refugees in Maryland. And when that didn't work out, they went to Delaware. The family was pushed to the margins. And this was a pattern that was set for generations.
But there was could you explain the head right system that was happening in Virginia at that time, as well as Mary, her original name, her birth name was Malala, coming from Angola. And then, as you said, changed it. Her name was changed. That she and her husband purchased John Kazara. How did that work?
Yes. So here, imagine, okay, so we're in 17th century colonial Virginia and Maryland. Land is plentiful, and we'll put aside for the moment whose land it was. Labor is scarce. And so the colony has this scheme to lure laborers by granting anyone who controls a bound laborer, anyone who owns a contract on an indentured servant or an enslaved person, the colony says you get 50 acres of land so long as you improve that land. You build a house, build a barn, grow some crops on that land. And so that was the way you got land. It wasn't worth so much, but the colony granted a head right of 50 acres to anyone without those bound laborers. So the challenge for Malala, Mary, and her husband Anthony was to assemble bound laborers and claim them as workers in order to get that land. And they were able to assemble 5 bound laborers. They may have counted themselves. They may have counted children. Anyone over 16 was considered a laborer. And if you could construe someone as owing a debt to you, then you could do that. Somehow they probably traded some livestock for title to an enslaved man, John Kazara, John Kazara, whom they enslaved. and this was the stakes of their family strategy. Now, John Kazara turned around and said, "Hey, I'm not enslaved. I'm just an indentured servant from across the bay." And one of the neighbors from a family named Parker took his side and took the Johnson family to court. And Mary, or Malala, persuaded her husband to let him go and say, "Look, we don't need this. We don't need the trouble." And they said, "Okay, we'll let him go." But then Anthony Johnson recognizes a problem, which is that we're next. We look enslavable as well. And so then he went back to court and he asserted his ownership over John Kazara as an enslaved person. And he won that battle in court. The court recognized Anthony Johnson as planter first and black man second. Mm-hmm. And Kazara remained enslaved to Mary Johnson even after Anthony Johnson's passing. There's records of him in Maryland. He ranched cattle as well, and he registered a livestock brand, but he was still enslaved to her.
And the quote that you reference, the Judge John Stronger, said the reason why Anthony couldn't own or bequeath any land to anyone, to his family, or his land could not be given to his family, be given to a stranger. The quote was, Anthony was a Negro, any by consequence an alien, and for that cause the land doth its sheet, return to the state. Did that a couple of times in Anthony and Mary's life.
That's correct. And so that was Virginia jurisprudence. Okay, it's open and shut, and they use this term alien.
And 12 jurors as well.
Yes. Yeah. And it was a court, right? It wasn't just the whim of one person. And so this is how racial wealth discrimination gets codified in law. It gets sewn into the jurisprudence of colonial America. Mm-hmm. And so if we can see that as a closing of a chapter of opportunity for families like the Johnsons to build wealth and pass it on to their children, then we can start to understand how wealth gains and wealth disparities grow. Because as everyone viewing this knows, wealth is a generational project. Why do we spend so much time worrying about our 403Bs, our accounts, our legacies, our retirements? What are we going to leave to the next generation? And so unlike something like voting rights, which presumably you can switch on, right? If people lack voting rights in the next election, we're going to open the polls, or in the next election, we're going to close the polls to anybody who can't show the proper ID. You know, these things are, we seem to be able to switch them on and off. Wealth is not like that. And so if we think about, excuse me, every dollar having a history, what is the history of your family wealth, of my family wealth? And then if we look at that over a long period of time, we can start to understand why it is we have such a tremendous wealth disparity by race in the United States today.
Mm-hmm. And before we move on and talk a little bit about Venture and Meg Smith, when I Googled the descendants, well, first talk about George Parker, who received the land, some 200 acres, I believe it was, of Mary and Anthony Johnson's land, and how his descendants have prospered in that area. But when I Googled them, they don't mention anything, well, I kind of snatched this land, stole this land from Anthony and Mary.
Yeah, so this is the Parker family of Virginia's Eastern Shore. And they were hostile to the Johnson family and took them to court and abetted schemes to take their land. And then once the Johnson family land became Parker family property, it grew. By the 18th century, there was this beautiful plantation. By the 19th century, the family had, thousands and thousands of acres, enslaved people. They were growing a number of crops on the Eastern Shore, and their Parkers fought and died for the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. And so you see this trajectory from, they were in the startup phase of this colonial project too. And all things equal, the Johnsons and the Parkers may have been, rival landowners for generations, but that's not how it worked. The Johnsons ended up with 0 in Virginia, 0 land. The Parkers ended up with a fortune. And based on the jurisprudence of the court that took the Mary and Anthony Johnson's land, it wasn't because the Parkers were savvier business people. It was because it came down to race, right? You are an alien and therefore not eligible for this economic opportunity.
We're joined by Arizona State Professor Calvin Schermerhorn, who's the author of his groundbreaking book, which debuts today, The Plunder of Black America: How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made. Talk a little bit about Brotour Furrow. That was his original name when he was enslaved in 1739 and kidnapped from Ghana. Brotour Furrow, who's the person that snatched him, changed his name to Venture, as he was an investment venture.
Yes, Brotour, this is a fascinating case. So here's somebody who grew up as the son of a nobleman in what I think and what scholars think is the far north reaches of Cameroon today. And so he was subject to a conquest, if you like, that put his father on the spot. And the conqueror came in and said, reveal your people's wealth and I'll spare your life. He said, I don't trust any promises that you make. And so Brotour saw his father murdered. He was soon kidnapped, separated from his family, marched about 1,000 miles to Ghana, to what's today Ghana and the coast, and sold to English enslavers who were coming from Rhode Island. And for a length of calico cloth and a measure of alcohol, he was bought and sold to a sailor named Mumford, who renamed him Venture, exactly as you say, Venture designating an investment. And so here's this boy, 10, 11 years old, now aboard a slave ship sailing across the Atlantic. The sailor Robinson Mumford decided, I'm not going to sell him in Barbados. I'm going to keep him and put him to work on Fisher's Island, which was the westernmost part of colonial New York, right off the coast of Stonington, Connecticut today. And so Brotour, now renamed Venture, grew up on this island, was made to do a number of very hard tasks. The Mumford children went to school or had tutors come to them, but Venture had to work and work very hard. Now, this Mumford family was an enterprising family of capitalists. They put a price on everything, and Venture soon learned that maybe if he could work a little bit extra over and above what they demanded of him, he could save up coins. He could eventually buy his freedom. On that island, on Fisher's Island, there were abundant resources to do that. He could trap fur animals, he could fish, he could garden in places where they didn't require that he could grow crops on his own. And he met Meg, who was in the same position as he was, also enslaved, also could describe the smell of a slave ship. She was transported across the Atlantic, and together they cooperated. They got married. They tried to build a life, but when Meg became pregnant with their first daughter, Hannah, they realized the laws of New York or the laws of Connecticut construe this baby as property, as someone who's kinless, who's someone who's the ownership bond between the Mumfords and Meg's daughter was stronger than her claim to her daughter as a mother. And so Venture decided to flee for the Maspee River on Long Island, maybe a safe haven. That plan failed, and the owner, George Mumford, sold him to a Connecticut buyer. And this starts a cycle, a crisis cycle in the Venture and Meg Smith. They didn't call themselves Smith at the time, but the Venture and Meg family, where each person who gets his hands on Venture or Meg decides they're going to use them like a cash machine. They're going to hold out this prospect of freedom and say, oh, if you just work a little bit extra, earn money on the side, we'll sell this to you. And the Plunder of Black America tells this story because Venture very clearly remembered the value of things. And so I could go back and calculate how much value he created, how much he earned. And it turns out that he he kept earning money for these enslavers who kept demanding more of him. And by the time that he became free and bought his kids, enslavers had drained about 66 years worth of income out of him. That is, he'd worked the equivalent of 66 years of an average New England family or an average New England earner, doing everything from fishing to selling produce to cutting wood by the cord to shipping wood to going to sea and going on this whaling expedition or this whaling voyage, this terrible whaling voyage from which he never really recovered, only to see that, in this cold New England economy, his wealth, his standing was extremely vulnerable. Now, historians have rightly celebrated Venture and Meg's achievement. They bought land up the Connecticut River. They had a home, they had acres. But compared to what they'd earned over a lifetime, this was a small fraction of the wealth they should have generated. And then in their old age, they had to eat that wealth. They had to sell off pieces and rely on their children. And so if you think about the success that they were able to achieve, there's also that tragedy that they should have achieved much more, because the people who enslaved them were the equivalent of millionaires today, who passed large sums of money to their children, or they passed the prestige of a home, of a business, in a place in which African Americans were not permitted to rise up the economic ladder.
What does Venture Smith's struggle to buy his family's freedom and to buy his children illustrate about the cost of Black determination in colonial America?
This is a wonderful question, because they had 5 children, and with each child now was the task to try to secure them, try to get them out of slavery, out of enslavement. And so it shows that every breath that Venture Smith drew was one that was filled with determination to keep his family together, to keep his children out of the clutches of enslavers. And when he had to go away to a season at a time to earn money, I mean, this was extremely painful, to be out of sight, to be unable to protect a wife and family from assaults, from predations inside a household, or from the chilly New England economy. In one case, he had, through his connections, gotten his son an apprenticeship with a shipping merchant named Church. And Church held out this promise of silver buckles to his son Solomon. Said, hey, if you sign up for this whaling voyage, when you come back, I'll give you the silver buckles. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. He was supposed to get an actual job with an actual a chance, a toehold in the New England economy. And what Solomon didn't know, but what Venture did know, was that a whaling voyage came with a 50% mortality. And so once Venture found out that his son had signed on to this whaling voyage, he rushed to the port. He rushed to Church's office and said, what the heck is going on here? Reverse this. He didn't get a chance because he saw the ship leaving. And on that ship was Solomon, 16 years old, who came down with scurvy and died aboard this whaling voyage. And so this was heartbreaking. Solomon had already spent years and years of income freeing him from the enslavers' clutches, only to see this predatory move in this first kind of misplaced act of professional trust.
It just takes your breath away. Takes your breath away. Let's talk a bit about Morris. We're now in the 1754, and I love that you center Morris as opposed to the person that we all know once you share about him and his life in Virginia in the 1754 up to 1795. Could you talk about Morris?
Yeah, Morris was born in Newgate County, Virginia in 1729. He was owned by a wealthy merchant and politico, John Custis IV, one of the most powerful men in Virginia. John Custis IV's son, Daniel Parke Custis, wanted to marry a beautiful teenage daughter of a planter named Martha Dandridge. Of course, John Custis did not like this, but he died in 1749, and Daniel Parke Custis married Martha Dandridge in 1750. And so Morris was a carpenter on their estate. It was called White House in New Kent County, and he was very good at what he did. He could join wood a dozen ways. He knew carpentry in and out. Now, in 1757, Daniel Parke Custis died without a will. Of course, Virginia didn't take his property. It went in thirds to Martha and their 2 surviving children. Now, Martha became the most wealthy widow in Virginia and attracted the attention of a young ex-officer, George Washington, who wanted to transition from militia colonel to planter. And so Washington married Martha. Martha Dandridge Custis became Martha Washington, and Morris, now called George Washington Master. So George Washington paid exactly 0 for Morris, even though he was a skilled carpenter. He was in his 20s. And by the time he'd made the coffins for the Custis children who died of the same illness that Daniel Parke Custis did, he was no closer to getting married, getting paid, or getting free. So George Washington, recognizing his talents, moved him up to Mount Vernon, and where there was a great need for carpenters in Fairfax County, Virginia. And some of the work on Mount Vernon that still exists was performed by Morris. Now, Washington didn't reward Black capabilities, but he did recognize it. And so he decided to promote Morris to the overseer of one of his farms. Now, when George Washington owned Mount Vernon, he was creating a kind of a diversified agribusiness. And Mount Vernon had 5 working farms. George Washington didn't want to grow tobacco like the Custis family. He wanted to diversify. So once he recognized that Morris could do the job of a white overseer, he had a good thing going, because he didn't pay Morris anything. I mean, he paid him a stipend, about 1/10 what he paid for a white overseer. And for that, Morris could live with his wife, Hannah. Washington only let about 1/3 of married couples on Mount Vernon live together because it was just inefficient, right? You don't want people who are working on different parts of the estate having to live under one roof, right? That was not good for management. So Morris got the management job. He was in charge of about 13 enslaved people, and he was the face of their enslavement. And so Morris toiled for 20 years, making this part of Mount Vernon run smoothly. He was in charge of assigning work, of accounting, how many hogs were slaughtered, how much herring had been distributed, how many apples were picked, were the tools in good order, who was pregnant, who was nursing, who was sick, who was able to do this or that. And so Washington came to depend on him. In his records, he wrote down, he didn't call the farm what he had called it before. He called it Morris's. Now, this was a good thing for Washington and Mount Vernon business-wise, and so he promoted other enslaved people into management as well. So that by the time George Washington went off to the Continental Congress in 1774, much of what was running at Mount Vernon was Black supervised. There was no question in his mind that Morris and the other African American managers were every bit as good as the white guys who came and went, who abused his trust, who stole his equipment, who ran roughshod over his enslaved workers. Morris did the job. Now, this didn't work out for Washington during the Revolutionary War because of the economic hard times. The United States, when they declared war rose up and declared independence from Great Britain, they broke up with their creditors. They broke up with their markets. They broke up with their economic lifeline. And so there were hard times at Mount Vernon, but Morris and Hannah managed their way through it. Washington trusted him so much that when the British threatened to come up the Potomac River, he hid his valuables, his rum, his good stuff over at Morris's place, because he trusted him so much. And then when a British sloop of war, the HMS Savage, came up the Potomac River, they blew up a Patriots plantation across the river in Maryland. They sailed across, trained their guns on Mount Vernon, and said, hey, any enslaved person who wants to come and join the British, come on down. oh, and by the way, we want food, we want supplies. And so Morris was tasked with giving the British those supplies. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when you hear and you read these stories, everyone, please purchase this book. Part of financial education is financial history education. But you think, well, how could these people treat these people, Black people, African Americans, in this way? And then you write in the book that the enslavers' justification for unpaid labor for their entire lives was claiming that raising enslaved workers until at least age 15 was a financial investment, and their first 8 years of adult work merely repaid their upbringing. This was a rationalization. Mm-hmm. They were doing the Black workers a favor.
Correct. And so this was the accounting. Now it was fake accounting, because by the time George Washington got a hold of Morris, he hadn't paid anything for his training, and Morris had already, if you want to say what's the value of your work versus the value of the quote unquote investment in food and training and clothing and medical care and shelter, Morris had paid that off by the time he was about 20. And so he was just earning a profit for the Custis family. He earned a profit for Washington over his lifetime. And Washington repaid that with token payments, £2, 10 pence at Christmas time, or whatever the equivalent was. But it wasn't enough to save. And so Morris and Hannah could maybe buy a length of cloth, buy some strings for an instrument, buy a new tobacco pipe, but they couldn't save that stipend. And so when Morris died at age 66 in 1795, they buried him in the dirt in the farm that he had superintended for 20 years, and that was it. Hannah was recorded as past labor, and what was recorded in the books makes me think that she had a chronic illness like hypertension that may have led to dementia or some disability. And she may have been freed by George Washington's will in 1799. He freed 123 people. But since Morris was property of Martha and the Custis estate, Martha Washington never contemplated freeing any bondspeople. And so only a fraction of those people enslaved at Mount Vernon ever saw the light of freedom. And if Hannah did, it was probably as someone who needed care, rather than somebody who could enjoy freedom as an independent woman after being enslaved for 40 years by George Washington. At his death, 93% of the residents of Mount Vernon were enslaved. And Washington and Martha enslaved about 577 African Americans over their long career. And so we think, okay, well, here's Washington. Maybe he comes around to thinking slavery's not a great idea, but he never gave anything back. I mean, he willed all of his property to the Custis heirs or Washington heirs, whether it's land or cash, stocks, valuables. Nothing went to African Americans except for his personal valet, William or Billy Lee, who suffered a debilitating injury in Washington's service. So he freed exactly one person in his lifetime.
Let's just be clear who George Washington was.
Oh, yes, the first president of the United States.
Okay.
Right?
Let's be clear.
If you got a dollar bill in your pocket, take it out and gaze at George Washington. He's got kind of a sour smile, and part of that was that he had
okay, go ahead.
really severe dental problems, and he paid for the teeth of Black donors, and we don't know to the extent to which they've donated those teeth voluntarily.
All right. And then Mount Vernon, let's also be clear, this was the mansion that Morris and other enslaved Black workers built. It's still standing, at least the bones, and it's currently used as a wedding venue, everybody. How insulting. How insulting. In the interest of time, please, everyone, purchase this book, but I definitely would like to touch on the Underground Railroad and Mary Bentley and her descendants to Canada. And everyone, please read about Harriet and Jack Adams in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and their advocacy, members in fighting for civic and economic rights there with members of the NAACP, created a home for so-called colored girls, etc. But could you talk about Mary Bentley and her descendants in the Underground Railroad in Canada? We don't talk about that area of the country much.
Yes. So Martha Bentley was the daughter of Harriet. Harriet had been promised freedom in Maryland in the early part of the 19th century, and then was kidnapped by and sold to a Georgia planter named John Martin. Martin had children with Harriet, probably not consensually. One of those children was Martha. Martha grew up on a cotton plantation in Georgia, and was moved around quite a bit. Now, the wife, Eliza Julia Martin, didn't like this. And so there was no divorce statute in Georgia at the time. And so the deal was get rid of them. That is, get rid of your children by enslaved women. So because Georgia also didn't sanction Black freedom at the time, John Martin hired a cart, hired a driver, and drove Martha Bentley up to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he dropped her off with a quote-unquote caregiver, gave her enough money for the caregiver, enough money for clothes and shoes and school. He went back to Georgia and died. So Harriet Bentley is now in Cincinnati, Ohio, one of the fastest growing cities in the early United States. This is around 1840, 1841. It's also a place of tremendous violence against Black middle-class citizens who showed by their strivings that they too could participate in this growing U.S. economy. And so in 1829, again in 1841, Martha Bentley probably saw the mobs descend on the First Ward in Cincinnati. But she's growing up in this environment where there's tremendously constrained opportunities, especially for Black women. And so she could have a choice of professions as a seamstress, as a washerwoman, as someone who scrubbed floors and emptied toilets. She didn't want that. So she took advantage of the Underground Railroad as a teenager and made it to Canada. And so this was what they called Canada West at the time, now Ontario, was a series, if you can imagine, dots of villages and communities on that plain that where African American expatriates came together for mutual support to try and make a living away from the slave catchers, away from the kidnappers in the United States. Because even though she was, nominally free in Ohio, the laws of Georgia followed her to Ohio. So if anybody caught her, if any of the heirs caught her and said, "Oh, you're actually property of the Martin family," she couldn't really contest that. So in Canada, she met another fugitive from enslavement, Henry Goings. They married and had 5 children. Those children, 4 out of those 5 children crossed back into the United States. All 5 crossed back in the United States, but 4 of them landed in Grand Rapids, Michigan, eventually. And that's where the story takes a turn, because here was a place where in the 1870s, if you wanted to pick one place in the United States where you could conceivably have all the opportunities of the new industrial economy, a place that did not have a history of enslavement, a place that was thoroughly Republican at a time when the Republicans were for expanding the franchise, for the opportunity of African Americans, right, to compete on a level playing field. But the book tells the story of this branch of the Goings family who did the hard work, who put in the hard work, but that yielded diminishing returns, as so many avenues to uplift in this industrial economy were closed because the factories didn't hire Black workers. The design industry didn't hire African Americans. There was discrimination in schools, discrimination in lending, and then after all that, the real estate industry started to turn on them and box them into this one corner of Southeast Grand Rapids. When the Goings family arrived in the 1870s and 1880s, they could and did live anywhere they wanted. They could buy real estate. And Michigan at the time was beckoning not only Americans from the East Coast, they were saying, hey, you Canadians, you French, you Dutch, come to Michigan, work in our industries. And this was the center of the furniture and industrial design industry, the first place in the United States with a multi-user hydroelectric power plant. I mean, this was ground zero for the American Industrial Revolution. Many cities shared that distinction. But then by the early 20th century, the Adams family, the Goings family found themselves ghettoized in a corner of Grand Rapids that federal policies dovetailed with local prejudices to create an enclave of concentrated African-American poverty. Mm-hmm. And so it's a story of tragedy because they played by the rules. They did the hard work. Minnie Goings, one of the subjects, had her own business, and she opened several locations for this business. The Goings men, they went to work. They tried to move up the ladder, but they found that ceiling, that career ceiling, very low. Mm-hmm. In a place where you had people like Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, who went to school with one of the Goings, James Goings. Mm-hmm. But Goings got his high school diploma, and the only thing he could do was wait tables. Gerald Ford got his high school diploma, and they said, well, go to the University of Michigan, play some football there, go to Yale Law School, come back, practice law, go into politics, these sorts of things. And so it's the story of, again, the idea that you're overcoming one set of obstacles only to see another set of obstacles spring up in its place.
So, Professor, let's talk about solutions. There's someone listening saying this was in the 1600s, the 1700s. Black people have Oprah and Michael Jackson or Jordan or any of those Michaels. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and stop just living in the past, Professor. You would say what?
I'm glad that you mentioned bootstraps. And this takes me back to a speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made in many forms, and it's very powerful. He said, no ethnic group in the United States has risen by their own bootstraps. And he pointed to things like homesteading, the massive giveaway of land, of federal land. He could point to things like Farm Aid. The federal government got involved in helping farmers in the early 20th century. Guess what? They helped white farmers, but not black farmers. White families got homesteading land. Black families tended not to. White families got FHA, federal loan guarantees on new property. Black families got excluded from those neighborhoods.
GI bills.
Mm-hmm. And the GI Bill created the middle class. And you say, well, there's nothing written in the GI Bill that's racist. True, but the architects knew that if they could have local agents pushing the white GIs off to college, the black GIs off to a vocational school, what's the value of an engineering degree from the University of Pennsylvania versus a brick making course at a veterans college? That's a pretty big income gap. So what Dr. King said was, you can tell a man to raise himself up by his bootstraps. It's a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to raise himself by his bootstraps. And so what he's suggesting is level the playing field, right? Try to at least include African Americans in those opportunities that have been freebies for white Americans for generations. And so the takeaway is, we have a lot of discussion around DEI today, most of it negative. What's the metric of success? I suggest the metric of success is wealth equality, maybe secondarily income equality. If there's a gap in income with an apples to apples comparison, again, a white male wages, black female wages, once they're aligned, we can get rid of DEI, right? What about the wealth gap? When that's equalized, currently, depending on the measure, it's either 15 or 16 to 1. That is for I'm sorry, not 15 or 16 to 1. It's about 8 times. So for every dollar a typical white household has, a typical African-American household has about 16 cents. that should be the measure of success, not the perception of unfairness. Because if we look back at the history of this, and the economist Laura Derenoncourt has this beautiful kind of economic visualization of this. Between 1930 and 1960, the wealth gap shrank at about 1% a year. During civil rights, the era of civil rights, it started to shrink at about 1.5% a year. Now, that's some slow growth, slow convergence, but at least we'd be on the path to equality. This diverged again in the 1980s, excuse me, 1980s, when the policies that came out of deregulation, of supply side economics, of cutting taxes on high earners, and gutting labor legislation, the wealth gap started to widen again. Mm-hmm. And so what can we do based on our empirical data, based on what we know about what tends towards equity, is to adopt those policies that someone like Dr. King would recommend, right? Take your boot off the neck of people who are seeking opportunity. Mm-hmm. And for all this talk about DEI is harming white people, it doesn't harm white people. In fact, most of the beneficiaries of affirmative action in DEI are white women. Mm-hmm. So we saw in the 1970s that African-American women's wages almost converged with white women's and then diverged again in the 80s and ever since. Right. So that could be a conversation, a national conversation we could have. And we've seen in the last few weeks, this is all on this sort of frontal assault on what's called DEI, which is reduced to this rhetorical name calling. But if you look behind it, look at the structural inequities, right? That's what we need to address. And we need to address them through legislation that levels the field, that guarantees fair practices, that takes the biases out of AI when AI is trained on, right, racist data. And what I mean by that is that you can't get a job, you can't rent a home without a credit check. And if credit checks have some inequities built into them, right, at credit reporting, then we have to look at that. And so what the book suggests as far as steps towards solutions is to look at those laws and practices that tend to widen equality and work to rectify that.
So who do you think would be a receptive audience for you? You can call anyone. Who would you like to speak to right now that you think that will warmly receive your proposal in this climate in 2025?
This is an interesting question, because California in the last several years has had a task force on reparations. And that task force has gone through and done the math and done the hard work of saying, what is it that has created wealth inequities and divergence in California? And it's an 800 or 900 page report. Mm-hmm. But I would like to speak to legislators who may have a superficial idea of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, and actually have them look behind the rhetoric and see what are the realities.
Right, and that legislation or that proposal was given the panache by Governor Newsom, would not allow it to move forward.
Yes, and that's unfortunate, because I would encourage any California or any state legislator to read that, any national legislator to read that. And so I think a receptive audience should be anybody who takes these issues of inequity or inequality seriously, who wants to get beneath the nasty rhetoric around this, which says that, oh, this just boils down to Black people trying to get something that they didn't earn. Because if I look back at my own family's wealth history, there's a lot of Uncle Sam putting a thumb on the scale in favor of my ancestors. This is not true. This would not be true if I had been born Black. Mm. And so if we think about that, maybe we can turn the page on this discussion.
Final question. How does America benefit by continuing its policies that widen the racial wealth gap, that continue to keep them in place?
I don't think anyone benefits in the long run.
How does America think because someone must think everything is wonderful. How would America say, this is fine, everything's fine, relax?
Yes. So if you got another hour, we can try to approach the issue of deep-seated racism. But here's something that the book tries to take issue with. The market is not self-correcting. The market, the free market, is one in which the history is with us, right? Every dollar has a history. The theft of dollars have a history too. And so we can't automatically think that, oh, if we just remove the regulation, remove the restraints, we remove this, the growth will emerge, that everyone will benefit from this. This hasn't been true over 400 years of American history because of the jurisprudence of those Virginia courts, because of the predatory nature of those New England enslavers who wrung cash out of Venture Smith for years and years and years. It's not true because of the legacy of Morris's family versus the Washington family, how wealth is concentrated in these ways.
Everyone, for a deep dive, and you have to have it, because it will cause you to reflect on your own family's history and to start to prepare or to accelerate your own generational financial security at minimum and generational wealth. Here's the book. Author of The Plunder of Black America, How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made. I've been honored to have a conversation with all of you and Professor Calvin Schermerhorn, Arizona State History Professor. Thank you so much for joining us here at Planet Wekeza.
Thank you, Sabrina. It's been wonderful.